In a quiet, dusty town where the streets seemed to remember every footstep that ever fell on them, life moved at a slow, predictable pace. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business before the sun even went down. If you bought a new shirt, your neighbor would know the price of it by noon. If you had a bad day, the whole town would be discussing it over dinner. In this town, standing out was usually a bad thing, and fitting in was the only way to live a peaceful life. But there was one young woman who just couldn't seem to fit in, no matter how hard she tried, or maybe, she had stopped trying a long time ago. Her name was Elena. She was 26 years old, but to the people in the town, she was a shadow. She was the kind of person you looked through, not at. She worked at the only bakery in town, a place that smelled of yeast and sugar, but Elena never smelled like sweetness. She always smelled of old dust and the harsh soap she used to scrub the floors. She wore the same oversized, gray coat every single day, winter or summer. It hung off her thin frame like a tent, the buttons barely holding on. Her shoes were always covered in mud, as if she walked through fields before coming to work, even though she lived in a small apartment right above the bakery. The locals didn't exactly hate Elena, but they didn't like her either. They treated her like a strange puzzle piece that didn't belong in their picture. When she walked down the street to buy vegetables or pick up a sack of flour, people would stop talking and watch her. As soon as she passed, the whispers would start. They would say she was slow or not all there. They made fun of the way she walked, with her head down, staring at her feet as if she were afraid they might run away. They laughed at her messy hair, which she always tied back in a tight, painful bun. The young boys at the hardware store would mimic her walk, limping exaggeratedly when her back was turned, thinking they were hilarious. Elena never fought back. She never yelled at them. She never even rolled her eyes. She just kept her head down and did her work. She would knead the dough in the back of the bakery with a strength that surprised no one because they never looked close enough to see it. Her boss, an old man who cared more about his bread than his employees, just grunted at her in the mornings and pointed at the ovens. Elena would nod, put on her oven mitts, and disappear into the heat. She lived a life of silence, surrounded by the noise of her own mocking thoughts and the distant laughter of the town. Then, one Tuesday morning, a bright yellow poster appeared on the community board outside the town hall. It was impossible to miss. It announced the annual City Talent Showcase. This was a big deal. The winner would get a cash prize and, more importantly, a chance to perform in the capital city where talent scouts from TV stations and music academies would be watching. Usually, the same people signed up every year: the church choir, the mayor's daughter who played the piano, the local dance group. It was a safe, boring routine. That afternoon, the town hall was buzzing. People gathered around the table to sign the sheet or just to see who had the courage to put their name down. The air was filled with excitement and friendly chatter. But suddenly, the chatter died down. A hush fell over the crowd as someone small and quiet pushed through the gathered bodies. It was Elena. She wasn't holding a bag of flour or a broom. She was holding a pen. She walked up to the table where the sign-up sheet lay. The mayor's daughter, a tall, polished young woman dressed in bright colors, was standing there. She looked at Elena with a look of pure disbelief, her nose slightly wrinkled. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with the kind of sweetness that hides poison. Elena didn't answer. She just leaned forward, her messy hair falling over her face, and wrote her name in small, neat letters at the bottom of the list. A few people leaned in to see what she had written. "Elena," one man scoffed loudly. "Elena the baker." Then, the laughter started. It wasn't the friendly laughter of a joke shared between friends. It was sharp and cruel. "Don't tell me she's going to juggle bread loaves," someone shouted from the back. The crowd roared. "Maybe she will recite the recipe for sponge cake," another person joked. Elena stood frozen for a second. Her hand gripped the pen so tight her knuckles turned white. But she didn't look up. She didn't cry. She simply put the pen back on the table, turned around, and walked away. The laughter followed her out the door and down the street. People were already making bets. "I give her 5 minutes before she runs off crying," said the butcher. "She's going to make a fool of herself on stage," agreed the school teacher. For the next week, Elena became the town's favorite joke. Wherever she went, people would hum circus music or pretend to play instruments badly on their brooms and shovels. "Hey, Elena, are you ready for the big show?" the delivery boy would tease, knowing she wouldn't reply. But amidst all the noise and the ridicule, Elena had a secret. It wasn't a secret she kept in a diary or whispered to a friend, because she had no friends. Her secret was hidden in her small, messy apartment upstairs. Every night, after the bakery closed and the town went to sleep, Elena would drag a heavy, battered case out from under her bed. It was a large, black case covered in faded stickers and scratches. It looked like something a trash collector would throw away. She would open the case on her kitchen table, revealing a beautiful, gleaming instrument that looked completely out of place in her grimy world. And then, for hours, while the town dreamed, Elena would pour her soul into this instrument. Her rough, dough-stained fingers would move with a gentleness and speed that seemed impossible. The sounds that filled her tiny apartment were not the clumsy noises the town expected. They were sounds of pure magic, sounds that could make a stone cry. But nobody heard them. The walls were too thick, and the people outside were too busy laughing to listen. As the day of the showcase got closer, the whispers turned into loud jeers. "I can't wait to see the look on her face," the locals said at the coffee shop. They thought they were going to a comedy show. They thought they were going to see the town oddity embarrass herself. They had no idea that the quiet girl in the gray coat was about to change everything they thought they knew about talent, judgment, and the quiet power of a dream. Elena wasn't preparing to fail. She was preparing to show them who she really was, and the shock was going to ripple through the town like a thunderstorm. The evening sun had finally set, casting a long, dark shadow over the small town, but inside the city hall, it was as bright as a summer day. The old building was usually quiet, used for boring town meetings or voting days, but tonight it was unrecognizable. Every single seat was filled. People were squeezed into the aisles, and latecomers were standing at the back, craning their necks to see the stage. The air was thick and hot, smelling strongly of popcorn, cheap perfume, and the excitement of a crowd ready for a show. This was the biggest night of the year for the community, the city talent showcase, and the energy in the room was buzzing like an angry beehive. Out in the audience, the mood was happy and expectant. Mothers were fixing their children's hair, fathers were adjusting their ties, and friends were whispering about who they thought would win. But when Elena walked into the back entrance of the hall, carrying that heavy, battered black case, the atmosphere seemed to change around her. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, her head down, trying to make herself invisible. She wore the same gray coat she always wore, looking more out of place than ever amidst the bright dresses and shiny suits of the audience. People noticed her immediately. "Look, it's the baker girl," a woman whispered loudly to her husband. "She actually showed up." A ripple of giggles moved through the back row. A few teenage boys pointed at the heavy case and mimicked lifting weights, rolling their eyes at each other. Elena pretended not to hear. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it thumping against her ribs, but she kept walking, one foot in front of the other, until she reached the side door that led backstage. The moment she stepped behind the heavy velvet curtains, the noise of the crowd faded into a dull roar, replaced by a different kind of chaos. Backstage was a messy mix of nerves and noise. It was a long, narrow corridor filled with mirrors, costumes, and rushing people. This was where the real performers were getting ready. And Elena was definitely not one of them in their eyes. To her left, a group of dancers were stretching their legs on the floor, wearing sparkly outfits that looked like they cost more than Elena earned in a year. To her right, a young man with perfectly gelled hair was tuning a shiny electric guitar, checking his reflection in the mirror every 10 seconds. Everyone looked professional. Everyone looked confident. And then there was Elena. She found a small wooden crate in the corner, shoved behind a pile of cables, and sat down. She placed the heavy case on her lap and held it tight, like a shield. A few minutes later, a girl with a high-pitched voice and a tiara in her hair walked by. She was carrying a clipboard and looked very busy, like she owned the place. She stopped in front of Elena and looked her up and down, her nose wrinkled in disgust. "Excuse me, you can't sit there," she said sharply. "That area is for the finalists." She looked at the dirty gray coat and the scuffed boots. "Actually, are you even a contestant? The staff entrance is around the back." Before Elena could even open her mouth, a man playing the piano nearby laughed. "Leave her alone, Karen. She's the town mystery act," he said, leaning back on his bench with a smirk. "Hey, serious question," he asked, looking at Elena's case. "What have you got in there, a tuba, or maybe you're going to do a magic show and pull a rabbit out of a hat?" The girl with the clipboard giggled, covering her mouth with her hand. "I heard she works at the bakery," she whispered loudly. "Maybe she's going to juggle bread rolls." The piano player laughed even harder, slapping his knee. A few other performers turned to look, amused by the chance to mock someone who clearly didn't belong. It was a classic bullying scene, the cool kids ganging up on the outsider. Elena sat frozen on her crate. She felt her face getting hot, but she refused to look up. She stared at a rip in the knee of her jeans. Her hands gripped the handle of the case so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to run out the back door and go back to her safe, quiet apartment. But then she remembered the sound of her music at night. She remembered how the violin felt when she played. She took a deep, shaky breath and kept her mouth shut. She knew that arguing with them would be useless. They had already made up their minds about her. Meanwhile, the show had started on the other side of the curtain. From backstage, Elena could hear the booming voice of the host announcing the first act, followed by loud applause. Then came the music, a pop band playing loud, energetic music. The crowd cheered wildly. Then a dancer performed a fast routine, and the audience clapped in time. Every time someone finished, the applause grew louder. The crowd was having a great time. For the other contestants backstage, this was fuel. They paced back and forth, humming to themselves, shaking out their nerves, high-fiving each other. They were ready to be stars, but for Elena, sitting alone in the corner, the sounds from the stage were terrifying. Every cheer made her stomach churn. It reminded her of how many people were out there. It reminded her of how many people were waiting to laugh at her. An hour passed, then two. The list of performers was getting shorter. The pile of snacks on the table was disappearing. The atmosphere backstage was getting tense. The piano player was wiping his sweaty hands on a towel. The dancers were holding hands and praying in a circle. And Elena, she just sat there, silent and still, like a statue. She had stopped shaking now. She had gone past fear into a strange kind of calm. Finally, a man with a headset walked into the hallway. It was the stage manager. He looked tired and stressed. "Okay, listen up everyone," he yelled. "Intermission is coming up after this next act. Then we have the final performance before the break." He looked down at his clipboard, frowned, and looked around. "Elena, is there an Elena here?" The room went quiet. The dancers stopped praying. The piano player looked up. All eyes turned to the corner. Elena slowly stood up. She was small compared to the others, her gray coat swallowing her up. "Yes," she whispered. Her voice was so quiet he almost didn't hear her. "You're on deck," the manager said, looking at her with confusion. "Get ready. You're up right after the comedy act. Go wait in the wings." She nodded, picked up her heavy case, and walked toward the dark area behind the stage curtains. As she walked past the piano player, he didn't say anything this time. He just watched her, looking a little unsure. The girl with the clipboard stopped giggling. There was something about the way Elena moved now, something different in her posture that made them fall silent. Elena stepped into the wings, the area just off stage. It was dark here, but she could see the bright lights shining on the stage. She could see the back of the host, and she could see the crowd in the distance, a sea of faces. The comedy act was finishing up. The audience was laughing and clapping. The host walked back to the microphone. "What a great act!" The host shouted into the mic. "Give him a hand, folks. And now, for our final performance before the intermission." He paused, looking at the paper in his hand. He hesitated, as if he was surprised to read the name. "We have a very unique performer. Please welcome Elena." The host walked off the stage and passed Elena in the wings. He gave her a quick, pitying look and a shrug, as if to say, "Good luck, kid." Elena stood in the shadows. She could hear the crowd. They weren't cheering. They were murmuring. She could feel the anticipation in the air. It wasn't the anticipation of excitement, it was the anticipation of a spectacle. They were ready for the joke. They were ready to mock her. This was the moment she had been waiting for, and the moment she had been dreading. She took one last breath, bent down, unlatched her heavy case, and pulled out the old, scratched violin. Then, as the stage lights hit her face, she stepped out into the blinding light. The spotlight hit Elena with the force of a physical blow. It was blindingly white, wiping out the world beyond the edge of the stage, but even with her eyes squinted against the glare, she could feel the darkness in front of her. It wasn't an empty darkness, it was a heavy, expectant void filled with hundreds of people. The huge red curtains behind her felt miles high, and the polished wooden floor under her boots seemed endless. She took a step forward, and the sound of her shoe squeaking against the wood echoed through the hall like a gunshot. For a second, there was a hushed sort of confusion. The audience leaned forward, trying to see past the light. They saw a small figure in a shapeless gray coat, hair pulled back so tight it pulled at her skin, standing absolutely still. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She didn't introduce herself. She just stood there, clutching her battered case like it contained the crown jewels. Then, the realization rippled through the crowd. It was her. The baker girl. The quiet one who everyone laughed at? The confusion turned instantly into noise. It started as a low murmur, like wind through trees, but quickly grew into open laughter. A man in the front row, a man who actually bought bread from Elena every Tuesday, nudged his wife and guffawed. "I don't believe it," he shouted, not even bothering to whisper. "It's the town ghost." Someone else whistled, a sharp, piercing sound that made Elena flinch slightly. "Hey, Elena. Did you bring us some fresh cookies?" a voice yelled from the balcony. The crowd roared with delight. They thought this was the comedy act. They thought she was there to be the fool. The air in the room changed from polite waiting to cruel amusement. The judges, sitting at their long table on the side of the stage, didn't look amused. They looked annoyed. One of them, a famous music critic known for his harsh temper, tapped his gold pen against his clipboard and sighed loudly. He looked at his watch, already counting down the seconds until he could leave. Elena felt the sweat trickling down her back, but her face remained a blank mask. She forced her legs to move, walking toward the single music stand placed in the center of the stage. It felt like the longest walk of her life. Every step was heavy. The laughter was getting louder, more aggressive now. It wasn't just joking, it was mean. People felt safe in the crowd, safe to be cruel because they were just one voice in 100. She reached the stand and placed her heavy case on the floor. The wood of the case was scratched and dented, a stark contrast to the shiny, pristine instruments the other performers had used. As she bent down to open the latches, a group of young people near the front started to clap rhythmically, slowly. "Elena! Elena! Elena!" They chanted, but not in support. They were mocking her. They were turning her name into a joke. Her hands were shaking, just a little, and because she was nervous, she fumbled with the first latch. It was stuck. The crowd groaned in unison, a sound of collective impatience and second-hand embarrassment. "Hurry it up!" someone bellowed from the back. "We haven't got all day." Another person shouted, "Get off the stage." The laughter intensified. It swirled around her, threatening to knock her over. It was a wall of sound, thick and suffocating. She finally yanked the latch open. Then the second. Then the third. She lifted the lid of the case. The room seemed to hold its breath for a split second, wondering what ridiculous thing she was going to pull out. A rubber chicken, a banjo, but when she lifted the violin out, the mockery didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. The violin was old. It looked ancient. The varnish was worn off in places, revealing the wood beneath. It had a dark, almost angry look to it. To the untrained eye, it looked like a piece of junk found in a dumpster. "Looks like firewood." The man in the front row screamed, laughing so hard he slapped his knee. "She's going to saw on some wood." Elena carefully tucked the violin under her chin. The position felt familiar, safe, like coming home after a long, terrible day. She tightened the bow, twisting the screw at the bottom. The screech of the horsehair against the frog of the bow was loud in the microphone. It made a terrible, scratching noise. The crowd winced and laughed even harder. "Make it stop!" a woman shrieked, covering her ears. The head judge threw his pen down on the table in disgust. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and stared at the ceiling. He was already writing his review in his head. He didn't need to hear the music. He had already decided she was a waste of time. Elena stood there, the violin tucked under her chin, the bow poised in her right hand. The noise was deafening. It was a cacophony of jeers, catcalls, and insults. It was a wall of hate coming at her from every direction. The theater manager was waiting in the wings, his hand hovering over the cut music button, ready to pull the plug on this disaster. She looked out into the darkness, but she didn't see faces anymore. She saw nothing but the memory of her small, lonely room upstairs. She remembered the cold winter nights when her only friends were the strings vibrating against her fingers. She thought about all the times she had been ignored, pushed aside, and treated like she didn't matter. She thought about the years of silence she had endured while the world laughed. A vein throbbed in her temple, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She was tired. She was tired of being the joke. She closed her eyes. It was a slow, deliberate motion. As soon as her eyelids fluttered shut, the laughter in the hall seemed to fade away, muffled by the wall of her focus. She blocked out the man screaming about cookies. She blocked out the woman laughing at her coat. She blocked out the bored judges. In the darkness of her own mind, there was only the music. It was building up inside her, rushing through her veins like fire. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the dusty air of the stage. The bow hovered inches above the strings. The crowd sensed something was happening and quieted down for just a moment, waiting for the first screech so they could explode with laughter. But the screech never came. Elena brought the bow down with a sharp, precise movement, digging it into the strings with a force that shocked everyone who saw it. She wasn't going to play a soft, gentle song. She wasn't going to beg for their attention. She was going to take it. The sound that exploded from the violin wasn't the clumsy, scratching screech everyone expected. It wasn't a joke. It was a scream of pure, raw energy that sliced through the laughter like a hot knife through butter. For the first few seconds, the audience didn't know how to react. Their mouths were open, ready to laugh, but the sound that hit their ears was so sharp, so fast, and so incredibly precise that it froze them in their tracks. The laughter didn't stop all at once, it kind of tripped and fell, fading away into confused murmurs. Elena didn't care. Her eyes were still squeezed shut, blocking out the world, but her body was transformed. The girl who usually hunched over to make herself small was now standing tall, her feet planted firmly on the stage. Her right hand drove the bow across the strings with a violence that made the wood of the instrument shudder, while her left hand danced up and down the neck of the violin with a blur of speed that looked almost impossible. She was playing a piece that was notoriously difficult, music that only the masters dared to touch. The man in the front row who had mocked her cookies was the first to go silent. His laughter had died in his throat the moment the music started. Now, he was staring, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open. He looked at the dirty, battered violin, then back at Elena's fierce face, trying to understand how this quiet bakery girl could make such a noise. The sound wasn't just loud, it was aggressive. It was like a storm trapped inside a wooden box. The notes raced up and down the scale, frantic and wild, yet every single one was perfect. In the center of the hall, the confusion turned to shock. People stopped turning to their neighbors to make jokes. They turned to look at the stage, actually looking at her for the first time. They saw the sweat already beading on her forehead. They saw the way her arm muscles flexed under the sleeve of her gray coat, proving that this took immense physical strength. The music was demanding, relentless, and beautiful in a terrifying way. It sounded like a fight, a struggle for survival, and it resonated with everyone in the room. It was the sound of all the anger she had kept locked inside for years. Backstage, the atmosphere changed completely. The girl with the clipboard had been checking her phone, bored, but when the music drifted through the heavy curtains, she froze. She looked at the piano player. He had stopped polishing his instrument. He walked closer to the curtain, peering out through the crack. "Is that her?" he whispered, his face pale. "It can't be." The dancers stopped stretching. Even the cynical stage manager lowered his hand from the cut button, his mouth hanging open. They knew music. They knew how hard it was to play that fast, that cleanly, with that much emotion. They realized with a sudden jolt that the joke was on them. On the judges' panel, the head critic, the man who had been ready to leave, slowly sat up in his chair. The annoyed look on his face vanished, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. He leaned forward, straining to hear every nuance. He had heard thousands of violinists in his career, students in conservatories, professionals in orchestras, but there was something different about this. It wasn't polished and perfect in the academic way. It was raw. It was dangerous. She was taking risks with the tempo, pushing the speed faster than it should have been able to go, yet she never missed a note. He dropped his pen. He didn't even notice it roll off the table and hit the floor. The music shifted suddenly. The frantic, racing speed slowed down into a haunting, mournful melody. The change was so abrupt that it felt like the wind had been knocked out of the room. The high, piercing notes dropped into a deep, vibrating hum that seemed to shake the floorboards. This part of the music was even harder to play. It required perfect control, a touch so light it felt like a feather. Elena's face relaxed, her expression softening from anger to deep sadness. It was as if she was telling a story without words, a story about loneliness, about being invisible, about standing in the rain while everyone else stayed dry. Tears began to stream down the face of the woman who had covered her ears earlier. She wasn't laughing anymore. She was clutching her husband's arm, digging her nails in. The husband, the man who had made fun of her coat, was staring at Elena with a look of shame washing over him. The room had become incredibly silent. You couldn't hear a cough, a whisper, or a shifting seat. The only sound in the vast hall was the weeping of the violin. It was a sound that reached inside people's chests and squeezed tight. They weren't just watching a performance anymore, they were feeling her pain. They were realizing that the girl they had mocked for years had a world inside her that they had never bothered to see. Elena moved into the final, complex passage of the piece. It was a whirlwind of notes again, a sprint to the finish line. Her fingers were a blur, the bow was bouncing on the strings, a technique called spiccato, creating a staccato rhythm that sounded like rain falling on a tin roof. The intensity was unbearable. She was putting everything she had into it, every ounce of her soul, every year of being ignored, every cruel word she had ever heard. She was throwing it all back at them, turning her pain into something magnificent. The audience was paralyzed. Hundreds of people were captivated by one small woman in a gray coat. The prejudice, the mockery, the social hierarchy of the town, it all dissolved in the face of such undeniable talent. The baker's customer, the mean girls, the bored teenagers, they were all gone. There was only the music. It filled every corner of the hall, bouncing off the high ceilings, vibrating in the bones of the people listening. It was a humbling experience. They felt small compared to the giant sound she was creating. She was playing with a fire that seemed impossible for her body to sustain. Her breathing was heavy, her chest heaving, but her hands never faltered. She was pushing the violin to its limits, drawing sounds out of it that seemed too big for such an old, beaten-up instrument. The wood was vibrating so hard it looked like it might come apart. As the song rushed toward its climax, the tension in the room became physical. People were leaning forward in their seats, their hands gripping their knees or the armrests. The judges were on the edge of their seats. Even the backstage crew were holding their breath. Elena's eyes opened, but she didn't see the crowd. She saw something far away, something only she could see. She poured every last bit of energy into the final run of notes, a cascade of sound that grew louder and faster, building up to a moment that felt like the sky was about to open up. The silence of the crowd was no longer respectful, it was terrified. They were terrified of missing a single second. They were terrified that they had almost missed this. They were realizing, with a sinking feeling in their stomachs, that they had been cruel to a genius. Elena's bow swept across the strings one last time, cutting through the air with the speed of a bullet. She slammed her hand down on the fingerboard, ending the song on a sharp, piercing note that seemed to suspend time itself. She held that position, frozen like a statue, her chest heaving, sweat dripping down her face and onto the floor. The final note vibrated in the air, echoing off the high walls of the hall, refusing to fade away. Then, silence. It was a silence so heavy and so deep that it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. For 3 long seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The man in the front row, who had been laughing the loudest, sat with his mouth hanging open, his eyes fixed on Elena like he was seeing a ghost. The woman who had covered her ears now had tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. The mocking teenagers in the back were quiet, looking at each other with confusion and fear. They didn't know what they had just heard, but they knew it was real. They knew it was something they couldn't make fun of. In the center of the stage, Elena slowly lowered her violin. Her arms were trembling, not from fear this time, but from the sheer force of the music she had just unleashed. She stood there for a moment, blinking in the harsh spotlight, letting the reality of the moment wash over her. She opened her eyes and looked out into the darkness of the crowd. She didn't see a sea of judges anymore. She saw hundreds of people who finally understood. Suddenly, a sharp sound broke the silence. It was the sound of a chair scraping against the floor near the judges' table. Everyone turned their heads. The head judge, the famous critic who never stood up for anyone, was on his feet. He wasn't looking at his clipboard. He wasn't looking at his watch. He was clapping. He started slowly, his hands striking together with a steady, deliberate rhythm. Clap. 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 That sound acted like a match thrown onto dry grass. The man in the front row stood up next, his face red with emotion. He began to clap, too. Then the woman with the tears. Then the teenagers in the back. One by one, person by person, the entire audience rose to their feet. The sound grew from a rhythmic clapping into a deafening roar. It wasn't just polite applause anymore, it was a thunderstorm. It was a wave of noise that crashed over the stage, shaking the very floorboards Elena stood on. People were shouting now, not insults, but her name. Elena. Elena. Bravo. The noise was so loud it vibrated in her chest. It was a wall of sound made of respect, of apology, of awe. Elena stood in the center of this storm, a small smile touching her lips for the first time that night. It wasn't a big, flashy smile. It was a tiny, shy, genuine smile that made her look years younger. She gave a small, awkward nod to the audience, then bowed deeply. It wasn't the practiced bow of a professional performer, it was a bow of gratitude. She held it for a long time, letting the applause wash over her, cleansing her of the years of being invisible. When she straightened up, she didn't look at the judges to see if she had won. She didn't look for the scorecard. She simply turned around and walked off the stage, clutching her battered violin case to her chest. The applause followed her, growing even louder as she disappeared behind the heavy red curtains. She didn't run away this time. She walked slowly, her head held high. Backstage, the atmosphere had completely shattered. The girl with the clipboard was standing with her back against the wall, her face pale as a sheet. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. The piano player was staring at the spot where Elena had vanished, his mouth open, looking like a student who had just been outsmarted by the teacher. When Elena walked past them, nobody said a word. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. They just parted to let her through, staring at her with a mixture of fear and total respect. The stage manager rushed up to her, but for once, he didn't look annoyed. He looked impressed. That was incredible, he stammered, but Elena just gave him a small nod and kept walking. Outside the back door of the city hall, the cool night air hit her face, fresh and sweet. She walked down the quiet street, away from the lights and the noise of the theater. The town was asleep, the streets empty and dark. It felt like hours ago that she had walked the same path, terrified and mocked. Now, she felt lighter. The heavy weight of other people's opinions had fallen off her shoulders. She knew that tomorrow, the town would be different. She knew the man at the bakery wouldn't yell at her. She knew the women at the market wouldn't whisper behind her back. She knew that when she walked down the street, people wouldn't see the weird girl in the gray coat anymore. They would see the woman who held 1,000 people in the palm of her hand. They would see the talent that had been hiding in plain sight. Elena walked up the stairs to her small apartment above the bakery. She unlocked the door and went inside. It was dark and quiet, just like she had left it. She placed her violin case gently on the table. She didn't need a trophy. She didn't need a prize. She didn't need the critics to tell her she was good. She had proved to herself that she was stronger than they thought. She had shown everyone that you cannot judge a book by its cover, and you cannot judge a person by the coat they wear. She sat down on her bed, tired but happy. The applause from the hall was still ringing in her ears, a sweet lullaby. Elena closed her eyes, a real smile on her face, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't the outcast. She was the star. And the world finally knew her name.